Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Hannah Song, and I'm the CEO here at Liberty in North Korea. Thank you all so much for joining us today to talk about one of my favorite and one of the most interesting areas on the North Korea issue, the changing information, media, and technology landscape inside North Korea, and how these changes are being driven by the North Korean people. If this is your first time joining us for a Link event, welcome. I wanted to give a quick overview about who we are. So Liberty in North Korea is an international NGO. We're working with the North Korean people to achieve their freedom. We help North Korean refugees escape through a modern day underground railroad. And we've been able to help over 1,300 North Korean refugees and their children escape safely and begin new lives in South Korea and in the United States. We also support them in their new lives in freedom, and we work to help build their capacity as storytellers, as advocates, and as agents of change on this issue. Lastly, and very relevant to our discussion today, we also work to develop strategies and projects that will empower North Korean people inside the country with more access to information and technology. Ultimately, we're working to mobilize an international movement of support to advocate for and support the North Korean people until they achieve their freedom. So before we jump into things, just a few quick housekeeping reminders. So at the end of this event, we're going to have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions or anything comes up during this discussion, feel free to drop them into the chat anytime. My colleagues, Sarah and Chelsea, are going to be there chatting with all of you, and we'll be gathering those questions to have ready for us. To start off with, we'd love to know where you're joining us from and also what brought you here. So go ahead and drop that into the chat now. I'm currently in our headquarters office in Long Beach, California, and Nat is in Washington, DC. Also, if you're having some sound issues, I found that the quality is usually better if you tune in from a computer instead of your phone. And also, if we freeze on the screen at any point, the best thing to do is probably just to exit out and to just rejoin the event. That usually solves the problem. We do have live captioning enabled. I'm not sure if that's on automatically. So if it's not, you can turn that on for yourself. And if you're having any issues, just drop us a chat. All right, so let's get into it. Over the last century, we have seen the power of information, how it can spark movements and transform countries and really put power back into the hands of the people. From the smuggling and distribution of foreign media behind the Iron Curtain to the use of social media in the Arab Spring, history has shown us that information and connection can lead to critical change. For specific context on North Korea, I want to share a really quick excerpt actually from one of the reports that was written by our speaker today, Nat. For more than half a century, North Korea has relied on an information blockade as one of its most important control mechanisms. Great efforts have been made by the North Korean regime to control exactly what information North Koreans have access to and how narratives around that information are constructed. This gives the North Korean leadership the ability to present their people with the picture of the outside world and their own country's place in it that best suits their ruling needs. A sense of fear and distrust in the outside world, against which the regime is the only protection, has been used as a form of control by many repressive regimes, and North Korea has proven expert at wielding this tool. In this environment, the North Korean leadership created one of the most powerful personality cults the world has ever seen. This strategy of fear, isolation, and unquestioning subservience has contributed to the regime's ability to remain in power against all odds and long beyond what most experts believed possible. North Korea remained effectively sealed off even as most similarly isolated regimes fell or began processes of opening and reform. It was only in the late 1990s when famine impaired the authorities' ability to enforce the blockade, and the people's hunger drove them to search for ways to survive outside of the public distribution system, that this sterile information environment in North Korea began to erode. That process continues today. And despite the incredibly low starting point, important changes in the information environment in North Korean society are underway. Today, I am very excited to have Nat Kretchun joining us for a discussion about how the information and technology landscape in North Korea has changed, how it's impacted the North Korean people, and what this could mean for the future of North Korea. Nat is the Senior Vice President for Programs at OTF, Overseas Technology Fund. It's a congressionally funded nonprofit organization that supports the development and deployment of anti-censorship, privacy, and security technologies for populations living under repressive information censorship regimes. Nat oversees the operations of OTF's multi-million-dollar funding portfolio. He previously served as Senior Associate Director at Intermedia, where he did extensive research with North Korean refugees, defectors, and travelers, doing annual surveys and conducting qualitative studies focused on information access in North Korea. He's the primary author of two of the most significant reports on this topic, A Quiet Opening and Compromising Connectivity, both of which you can find available online for free, or maybe we can find the link and drop that into the chat if you'd like to take a look. I've had the privilege of knowing Nat for almost 12 years. We have benefited greatly from his expertise and knowledge on this issue, and we've been able to work closely together on numerous projects. We are very grateful to have him join us today to share some of his thoughts and insights. Welcome, Nat.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Really great to be with y'all. Always happy to see the Link crew out in force. So really happy to be here today.
Thanks, Nat. So just to start things off, would you mind sharing a little bit more detail? I gave some very broad context from one of your reports. And so maybe you can share a little bit more color around some of that context. Like, what are some of the biggest changes in North Korea's media environment over the last 30 years, sort of pre-marketization versus post? And also maybe you can explain what are the main ways North Korean people are accessing foreign media and information?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I brought along a few slides, which we can kind of flip through, which hopefully will help set the scene a little bit. So if we go to the next slide, it's always important to acknowledge that researching North Korea is difficult, even in the best of circumstances. There have been incredible innovations in essentially the tools we have at our disposal to be able to better understand the information environment and the way it's developing. But at the end of the day, human surveys are always going to have important caveats about non-representativeness, and refugees, defectors, travelers will always be in some ways incapturably different than the home population and will not be able to perfectly quantify that. So it's important to know that as we kind of jump into some of the findings of the broader research portfolio, which do rely on both surveys of North Korean refugees, travelers, and defectors, as well as some technical analysis of North Korean ICT devices. So next slide. I started doing this research in about 2009, and it was almost immediately apparent when we were surveying folks who had recently left North Korea that actually the picture that the media had painted of this totally isolated hermit kingdom was not actually the case. As you mentioned in your introduction, Hannah, the famine period had really done a lot to open up the North Korean environment. So we saw immediately that folks had access to what we think of as traditional broadcast media. So that's TV and radios. And while certainly they consumed, state content, they watched North Korean Central broadcasts or listened to North Korean Central broadcasts, they also, in many cases, were able to use those to access foreign media that bled over either from China or from South Korea, depending on where folks were located. We were also able to track the beginning of what would become a really important phenomenon of essentially non-network digital devices. So that's our USBs and our SD cards that were flowing across the Chinese border with trade between North Korea and China. And those were carrying South Korean dramas and soap operas, Hollywood movies, and a whole host of new forms of content that previously had been totally absent in the North Korean information environment, and really did, I think, for the first time, break what was that very kind of isolated environment that existed prior to the famine. Next slide. And a really interesting thing we were able to model statistically when we started digging into it further was that exposure to outside information really did have an impact on people's thoughts and beliefs and attitudes. Obviously, North Korea being the hyper-restricted security state that it is means they weren't always able to act on new thoughts or beliefs or attitudes, but it was very easy when we took groups of quite exposed to outside information North Koreans and those who had been relatively unexposed and compared those in kind of a robust statistical fashion. The differences were very obvious in a way that it's clear that there is a demonstrable impact. Next slide. Well, a really interesting thing we've seen since then is that our understanding of this kind of post-famine period in which folks are listening to broadcast media or watching TV that's bleeding over from South Korea and China, that they're getting, the latest dramas on USB from South Korea, was actually kind of an outlier period. In the Kim Il-sung era, as we kind of discussed, there was basically a near total information blockade, very few sources of outside information. Then we have this post-famine opening where essentially the North Korean security state is atrophied enough that a lot of things are floating around in a way that they're having trouble keeping up with. What we are now realizing and starting to contend with for the first time is that in the Kim Jong-un era, we are really seeing an attempt to reestablish really strong information controls domestically inside of North Korea. And interestingly, the way that they are doing that is not by trying to go back to some pre-digital past of the Kim Jong-il or the Kim Il-sung era, rather. Instead, they are leveraging technology, these new tools of the digital authoritarian, to try to basically create a very clean, highly censored, highly surveilled information environment that looks quite modern. Next slide. When we look at kind of the traditional information delivery channels too, we understand that there's like a lot of efficacy for the North Korean regime in pursuing this new strategy. Broadcast media, as far as we can tell, seems to be relatively stable. But there's not any sort of like meaningful growth in those numbers that we can ascertain at least. Non-network digital, so our kind of USBs, SD cards, all of that requires physical distribution. You have to smuggle those things across the border and then they have to flow within North Korea. And in a context in which the border is very effectively sealed, not much new information of that sort is flowing in. Those levels are way down, and that was a really important component of North Koreans' access to outside information previously. What has taken its place, essentially, is the rise of networked digital devices. So that's cell phones and tablets, which are on North Korean domestic networks. They're also devices that are provided by the state very intentionally. What this has basically done is, on the one hand, it's catalyzed word of mouth, which has always been an important source of information in North Korea. It's allowed North Koreans basically to talk to each other more easily across time and distance. But it has also given the North Korean authorities far more technologically advanced tools to censor and surveil their own people as North Koreans increasingly adopt cell phones and tablets. Next slide. So when we look at both what North Korea is doing from a legal, a security enforcement, and a technological perspective, we can really get a sense of what their information management priorities are. Obviously, there is a huge emphasis on censorship. North Korea is attempting to create a very clean information environment in which there aren't a bunch of South Korean dramas floating around, in which K-pop songs are not being secretly traded by young people, in which news reports from outside are basically inaccessible. Surveillance is also being modernized in some important ways. North Korea in the past had kind of a mass mobilization form of surveillance where they tried to get everyone to watch everyone else, and then lines of reporting flowed up vertically through the bureaucratic state. Now, as there is less ability to manage such a large bureaucratic apparatus for security enforcement, they are increasingly able to rely on people's digital activities to essentially do the same thing by dint of their phones. A couple of other important adjuncts as well are cell phones are really important to North Korean gray market economic activities, which have helped the country weather difficult economic and production circumstances. And so having that lifeline remains very important to them, even if the cell phones are simultaneously a source of control in country. And then finally, there's real public relations gains. Most North Koreans really enjoy their cell phones, even if they are surveillance machines that are quite limited in functionality. And the regime enjoys some kind of goodwill as a result of the increased accessibility of these types of devices. Next slide. So this is a little diagram that basically shows the intensity of North Korean censorship apparatus. This is hard for us to fathom basically anywhere else in the world. The next most intense censorship regimes are not near this restrictive. So basically, at the device level, every piece of content that you'd like to view, add, share on a North Korean phone requires a cryptographic signature that is issued by the state or that is self-generated by the phone. So this basically is a whitelisting principle in which it's not that they're trying to censor the things that they don't like. They're attempting to only allow those which are specifically approved. And that is just like a level of digital hygiene around censorship that we see basically nowhere else in the world. Next slide. However, a thing that we've long been able to count on and is certainly still in its nascent state, but is very fascinating to watch, is essentially how the ingenuity and creativity of the North Korean people plays out in this new information control reality. Back in the day when people were relying on radios, they would go in the back of fixed dialed radios where the dial had been soldered so that only the North Korean state channels were available. And they'd go in through the back and tune them, by hand by taking the back off a radio. That's a lot harder to do on a cell phone when the North Korean regime has really great human capital capture of everyone who's trained in computer science in the entire country. And yet still, we are seeing people begin to hack and modify these devices. Certainly it looks very different than a kind of hacker culture you'd see almost anywhere else in the world. It is still far behind the technical sophistication of the state, and the state is very clearly attempting to preserve that technological advantage by focusing on things like non-tamperability of media devices. However, it's a phenomenon that is only going to continue and probably strengthen as people have more time and there's more access to essentially computer science talent in the country. Next slide. So maybe where I'll wrap up then, then we can go to questions, is basically in setting up the fact that what used to be more or less a unified information environment, you had radio and TV flowing in across borders in a broadcast way. You had smuggled physical media, USBs and SDs carrying South Korean dramas circulating throughout the country, has really become kind of two cat and mouse games now. That continues, even though the state is finding all sorts of creative new ways to crack down on it, and we expect further innovation in that space. But we now have a much more domestically focused and far more technologically enabled version of cat and mouse, which is happening over the cell phone networks and North Korean, digital devices that are much more readily available in the country and much more widely adopted. And we find ourselves at an interesting crossroad in which we're having to kind of contend with both these information environments simultaneously in a post-COVID era where still there is very little access to the country and very little is moving in or out. So I'll leave it there in terms of a little bit of background, but happy to chat further, obviously.
Thanks for that, Nat. I think it's super interesting. I have so many questions, and I imagine that many people do too. So this is just a reminder that you can go ahead and drop your questions into the chat anytime, and we'll be gathering those, and we'll have a chance to get to some of that shortly. But of course, I'm going to monopolize the time first and ask my questions to Nat. So just because you kind of ended with talking about the pandemic, I'd be very curious to know sort of what are some of the biggest trends and changes that you're seeing really as a result of the pandemic and how it's impacted. A lot of these changes were underway over the last, few decades, and it was seemingly increasing. It was despite the North Korean government's best efforts. There was a lot of these interesting trends that were sort of developing, and then the pandemic happened, and it sort of seemed to naturally put a pause. Obviously, borders were shut down and all of that. And so what are some of the changes or trends that maybe you're seeing or that you're hearing that have been a result of the last few years?
Well, one of the most difficult to wrangle with, honestly, is our difficulty in monitoring those trends.
Right.
As fewer people come out, there are fewer people to talk to who have updated information. We have less access to new North Korean devices that we could reverse engineer to figure out how the software and hardware is evolving. So certainly our efforts to understand the North Korean information environment have been pretty significantly hampered as a result of the pandemic and the border closure. Some of the other concerning developments are basically just in how tightly sealed the North Korean border has become, which has a few different knock-on effects. On the one hand, we see that not only are we having to deal with securitization on the North Korean side of the border, but also on the Chinese side of the border. So now, not only do you have to be able to bribe that guard on the North Korean side or figure out some sort of way to get through, you also have to wrangle with a much tighter enforcement and security situation on the other side of the border once you get there. What this does in effect is increases the price to be able to move across the border. And that affects all sorts of things like remittances being sent from North Korean escapees back to their friends and families in North Korea. It affects the flow of, dramas and other media into North Korea. And then also, as I mentioned, what we're able to get out from North Korea. So, we still occasionally get devices that make their way out or pieces of software, and we continue to do our best to learn everything we can from new arrivals from North Korea, but it's just a much smaller flow, which affects a bunch of things downstream.
Yeah, and I think those are definitely a lot of the same sort of impacts that we've seen on even the rescue work, similarly because of the border shutdowns and just the significant rise in costs. That's why refugee rescues have become significantly more costly and also significantly more dangerous and difficult. So it's really unfortunate. And it's one of these things where I think we're just kind of watching and waiting to see if we feel like the situation will alleviate or we're in kind of a new era that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with these types of circumstances.
And it's exactly the kind of catalyzation that you would imagine the North Korean authorities wanted. That's a really hard thing to pull off unless you have essentially the whole world essentially conspiring with you to shut borders and stop travel. It's a lot easier to not turn something back on than it would have been to stop a quite robust flow anyway. So similarly hoping we see things pick back up again, but it's not the most hopeful of times at the moment for that.
Yeah. I want to go back. I know you touched on this a little bit as well, but I do think this is really important. We understand the importance and the significance of North Korean people having more access to information from the outside world and technology to be able to consume that information safely. But what are some of the other ways the regime is cracking down? Information dissemination, this is a huge threat to the regime. Obviously, it is eroding, ideology, propaganda. It's changing the way people think about themselves, the outside world, their own country. So we've heard of and seen, obviously, a changing, it continues to evolve, and it's surprising sometimes to see the rate at which the regime can respond very quickly and adapt. So what are some of the things that you've seen the regime is doing to try to really clamp down on this type of media consumption, distribution, sharing? And then what are these risks to North Koreans? Even from the most recent media reports in the last few days, the punishments have been and continue to be incredibly extreme for some of the most basic types of things that people are doing. So maybe you can share a little bit more about sort of what are some of the ways that regime is cracking down, some of the other tactics, and then the sort of big risks to North Korean people and the consequences that they face?
Yeah, so kind of thinking about censorship, classically, we have kind of three tools that regimes will tend to use. We think of those as fiction, fear, and flooding. And North Korea uses all of those in very unique ways. So friction basically applies to barriers that you're putting up so that people can't access content you don't want them to. That is really when we get into the incredibly tight censorship that's happening on North Korean devices. They have pretty much created a clean domestic network. So that goes for both the intranet and then the mobile cellular networks and the devices that are attached to those. Because those are all essentially hooked up to one coherent internal network, they're able to enforce a lot of rules that would be very difficult to do on, random non-connected devices that kind of defined the previous era. In doing that, we've really seen a huge regression in the amount of content that people have access to. In the early days of cell phone, we saw people sharing ebooks and videos, pictures, and things over Bluetooth on their cell phones. Very quickly, the North Korean regime has been able to update priors, make technological changes, push those out, and find ways to make it a very clean, whitelisted system. I think the thing on the friction side that we're worried about is that they will start to say, okay, not only do you have your cell phone and your tablet, you also have an IPTV box, one of these kind of manbang type setups that will give you access to any North Korean TV on demand. So therefore, you don't need a broadcast TV anymore. And radio's gone anyway. So why don't we just say that that's all you need now? And with that, they have now added TV to the network, and they can not only see what you're watching to make sure that you're consuming enough North Korean propaganda, but also they've essentially locked down another device to make sure that it can't be involved in accessing outside information. In terms of fear, as you alluded to, North Korea does a lot. Not only are punishments extremely high, as you mentioned, and the risks to accessing outside media extremely high, they've also been doing a lot of bureaucratic innovation in the way that they are cracking down on media. So folks who pay attention to this issue closely may have heard of things like Group 109. And these are essentially specially tasked units that pull from different parts of the security apparatus. And it basically means that these are units that are looking for ideological crime, so that's accessing outside information, but also they are extremely hard to bribe because the units don't trust each other internally. Back in the day, you were policed by your local police officer. You might have had some sort of relationship. You're going to see them time and time again. You can build trust over a long time. You could potentially pay a bribe. That's a lot harder to do these days. Bribes are more expensive if you're able to pay them at all for some of these ideological infringements. And then on the flooding side, we normally think of flooding in an internet sense as like, troll farms and things that are propagating counter narratives. In North Korea, that's essentially the modernization of the propaganda apparatus. If you watch North Korean TV now, it looks a lot better than it did in the not too distant past. And similar to North Korean entertainment, it still doesn't hold a candle to anything from South Korea, but it's a lot less boring, kind of only the party instructional material type stuff than it once was. So while not exactly compelling, they are attempting some substitution effect by essentially having a little bit better content.
Yeah. One of the things I know that we had talked about previously, and this has come up a lot, is even just one of the ways in which the North Korean government is constantly monitoring and tracking is when they had implemented in their new system the way to kind of take screenshots, random screenshots, and then to kind of be stopped at any given point to check what's in your random screenshots folder, which you cannot delete. Can you talk a little bit more about that technology?
Yeah, and that goes right back to that fear factor and is, shows the way in which like native innovation in North Korea is really defining a whole new kind of information controls. they basically needed to find a way to interface the technological surveillance capacity of a cell phone with, non-technical security officers. And a really easy way to do that was to say, okay, we're going to have this cell phone take random screenshots when you either open a file or just at random times. Those are potentially evidence that can be used against you of anything, inappropriate, quote unquote, you might have done on your cell phone. And they are easily accessible to an official who can stop you at any time and search your cell phone. Not only that, because the user can't delete them directly, it's a huge deterrent effect. If you are scared of what your cell phone could capture, then you're not going to take any risks on it. So it both did a great job in deterring people from experimenting, but also was a great enforcement mechanism that interfaced perfectly with security officers who then only needed to know, okay, I go to this folder, which is the same on all the phones, and look for the screenshots and just look for anything fishy.
Right. I think another sort of classic North Korea is the App Store. A lot of people probably wonder why, you can't just go and download the apps that you want the way that we can. I don't think we have a photo of that, but the App Store in North Korea is just a physical place. It's
something I should have brought along. But that interestingly cuts a little bit in both directions, because on the one hand, yes, it means that you have to go to a physical location to get apps on North Korean phones, which just sounds insane and reminds you of like how different a place we're talking about from some of these, basic technological realities. On the other hand, what it does mean is that for approved apps, at least, the App Store owners have to have a program that allows them to load apps onto phones. That means that they have a little bit of flexibility in what is otherwise a very, strictly enforced rule set. And so when App Store sellers say like, okay, this person bought the new Angry Birds ripoff that they're going to play, which is totally legal and fine in North Korea, you enter in some information about the cell phone onto this APK, it gets loaded onto the cell phone and it works. Well, that's just a little tiny window in which you could start to load not approved information onto cell phones as well. So it's often in the little accommodations that have to be made in things like physical app stores that all of a sudden make these things harder. If North Korea is able to do more over the network, that might actually decrease a little bit because they'd be able to more tightly control what apps were downloaded and with what permissions.
Right. Yeah, it's such an interesting and fascinating, but also incredibly harsh environment, to think about young people who literally want to watch a drama, or they want to, the quality, the content is so much better. And then to think about the extreme levels of punishment that they face, some of them even being executed. And again, just really playing into that fear and, of the regime, of these types of behaviors. It's just it's so difficult, I think, to fathom for us on the outside, this reality.
Yeah, and often some of the smallest details are in some ways the most insidious. A thing that we have seen in the Kim Jong-un era especially is a real kind of focus on the ideological health, quote unquote, of young people. Mentions young people a lot in his speeches, and a lot of the reforms we've seen to kind of anti-reactionary ideological laws in North Korea focus on the smallest infractions, using South Korean inflected words in speech. Because essentially, if North Korean authorities get to the point where they can control the media files, they then have to figure out ways to better police the media content of things like text messages, which people can send to one another. And so by looking for signs of South Korean inflected, formulations of words and phrases is just one more way to essentially increase fear and paranoia in ways that really is like, you're getting down into the way people speak that is, pretty unfathomable in most places.
Yeah, I think that was recently reported. I can't remember the exact details of a young group of a group of young people who kind of were busted for using South Korean dialect and have been punished quite severely because of that. So we have a few questions here that I think might be good to kind of drop in here. So Aman asks, how much do North Koreans actually care about accessing outside information? I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, and it's one that I think you can approach and answer in a bunch of ways. I think we can very confidently say that the demand always far outpaces any supply that we have seen to date. I mean, that's clear just in terms of the lengths that folks will go to receive this information. And also in the periods in which enforcement was less strict, how many folks very quickly not only began to access outside information, but were sharing it with friends and family and making that kind of a core of their social interactions. That said, there's a lot of different reasons that North Koreans might attempt to access outside information. Some of them, at one end of the spectrum are a bit more like political or ideological, things like that. But there's lots of folks who they rely on trading for their livelihood, and they're interested in any sort of supply shocks happening in the outside world that might trickle through to exchange rates in North Korea, because North Koreans don't rely on the won for all that much. They'd like to hold money in foreign currencies, and so there's a lot of foreign currency trading that happens. So anything that might upset relative currency rates or the supply of certain goods into North Korea is important for market operators. I remember talking to fishermen and essentially boat captains who didn't believe the North Korean weather reports as being sufficiently sophisticated and went out of their way to find South Korean, weather reports so that they could stay safer. And then there's just a lot of folks who are able to compartmentalize things. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance that has to happen, but are basically looking for a way to unwind, to have some relief, some psychological escape, even though they're not really acting on it in any meaningful way. And I think that's a lot of what the dramas, the love stories that flowed into North Korea in that most open period were really doing.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of piggyback off that, we, again, sort of pre-pandemic era for sure, and when there were far less restrictions. But I think we saw a lot of young people, especially, right? Like the behaviors predominantly amongst young people having a higher risk tolerance and being more interested in sharing these things with friends and family, both from a social perspective. But, we would hear in interviews with North Koreans and in talking to them as well about how sometimes it was even perceived to be cool. If you were familiar with certain South Korean terminology that people were throwing around, it's kind of like, if you know, right? Like you hear this term and you recognize it. And for everyone else that's not watching dramas or South Korean foreign media, they just don't know it and it just flies right past them. But there was this sort of acknowledgement where we would hear all these anecdotes from different North Koreans sharing about how, I used to be such a rebel. You're not supposed to wear blue jeans, but I would wear these black jeans. And then in the kind of amongst their friends would like pull up their shirt and be like, see, these are jeans. And it was like very cool and hip. And so it's really interesting to kind of talk to young people and to really understand even just how they think about their approach, their attitude around these types of behaviors, their threshold for risk and their tolerance for that and all of these things. And so I think there's so many different elements of like why people might be interested in it or how they might end up consuming it, even if accidentally. I have another question here, which is quite interesting. I think this feeds into the earlier question about sort of the regime's response, but Ada asks that with the rise of AI models, is there a high risk that the regime will utilize this type of technology? Do you think that AI will cause another major wave of change for North Korea's information environment?
Yeah, it's something that I think we're wrangling with in a lot of digital authoritarian states across the globe. North Korea has taken a lot of steps to ensure that that it has a huge home field advantage, essentially, that its operating environment is very constrained. It's not connected to the global internet in any meaningful scale, and that's quite intentional, and I don't really expect that to change anytime soon. That said, we know that over cell phone networks, there is the potential to do a lot more mass collection, mass analysis of the data that is being generated by North Koreans using their cell phones than we see being leveraged for security ends currently, at least. Certainly if someone is suspected of a crime or becomes, put under suspicion, then their text messages might be used against them. Things that they say to others on phone calls could be used against them. The surveillance vectors are very clear, but I at least have not seen a whole lot of evidence of the regime using essentially mass surveillance as an exploratory policing tool to try to say like, all right, let's have our feelers out and try to catch anything that looks like it could be an infraction, and then use that to follow up with people. It tends to be something that bolsters and nuances a case against someone at this point. So certainly the North Koreans are careful students of other authoritarian regimes, but I think we can also expect them to apply it in their own very special Juche way that we will always have to kind of wait and see on.
I think it's so interesting to talk about, hear all of these different anecdotes and about how the information media technology landscape in North Korea has changed, and again, how it's impacting North Korean people. I think one of the most important things is just that fundamentally information and technology dissemination efforts are some of the most effective strategies and approaches actually when it comes to North Korea. And especially because there is something that we can do from the outside to contribute, support, and accelerate these types of changes. So I'd be curious to know if you could talk a little bit about, obviously this is an area of work you are doing day in and day out. Why do you believe that information dissemination is so important as a core kind of approach and strategy on North Korea?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a few different reasons that all kind of tie into that. Maybe least inspiringly, there's some sort of thing that's analogous to that old Churchill quote about democracy being the best form of government except for all the others. If we're thinking about your other options in terms of like attempting to affect change in North Korea, diplomacy has been tried a bunch recently and has proven relatively fruitless, even when conducted at quite a high level. Both very harsh sanctions and economic inducements have been tried at different times, and in quite intense to a quite intense degree on both sides, both the kind of carrot and the stick at different times, both without kind of inducing any sort of fundamental change. Military options are like too scary to even contemplate. And so if you're kind of working through that dime framework of, diplomacy, information, military, and economic options, like information like remains as the one that has both been least leveraged to date, has the potential to catalyze and empower North Korean people and some of the nascent economic and social trends that are happening in the country, and also has the least horrific downsides when we're looking at the risks of attempting that, even though to affect change in North Korea in any way is always going to be, fraught with some sort of risk. And I think my time in researching North Korea, particularly the way information flows into and then amongst people inside the country, has really just been, for me, to be constantly impressed by the creativity and the ingenuity of the North Korean people. And so when you are trying to figure out something to bet on, that is the one that resonates most powerfully for me in that way. There is an incredibly high capacity to normalize very difficult circumstances and to survive through incredible things in North Korea. But there's also incredible capacity, I think, that, we see the country is changing. It is not always easy to see from the headlines, from the outside looking in at a high level. If and when some of these important social and economic changes add up to something more fundamental is difficult, if not impossible, to predict. But there's real movement there, and it is worth, I think, attempting to invest in trying to catalyze some of that movement.
Yes, absolutely. I think as you've worked on this issue for a long time and you've been learning and seeing these things. Could you maybe share, like you said, I definitely agree. North Korean people are very underutilized, I think, when it comes to some of the most effective strategy, the approaches on these issues, some of the best partners for this work. And over the years of meeting with North Koreans, learning from them, hearing from them, and working with them, I've also been so impressed by their innovation and ingenuity and creativity. So I wonder, in all of the research and interviews that you've done, if you could share maybe like one or two stories about, individuals that you've met that have really just kind of surprised you, impressed you, that have left kind of a meaningful impression on you.
Oh my gosh, it's hard to know even where to begin. But I would say I've seen versions of this happen both with folks kind of inside the system, quote unquote, and those who are very outside. So maybe to start with the latter first, to just think of some of the folks who in the most dire times in the famine period were basically able to, having no access to information, having effectively no training, figure out how to survive when everything that they knew and their parents knew had been based around a system that was meant to work in one way. It was the public distribution system gave you what you needed to survive, and in return you were completely loyal. And to just see the flexibility of folks that both you and I know who overnight were effectively able to become currency traders or supply things that their local area needed in ways that just incredible talent and flexibility always continues to shock me. And then amidst all that, just the kind of humanness of all of us in terms of how similar people are, then they would go home at night, and the way that they would relax after essentially creating capitalism and coping mechanisms for themselves from whole cloth, more or less, was to watch some Hollywood movie or some South Korean drama in a way that was just so incredibly identifiable to any of us who comes home after, frankly, a much less arduous day at our office to then say, oh man, I gotta unwind. And so a little bit that the impressive inventiveness that's able to happen, and then also a little bit the obviously identifiable humanity happening there. And then I guess the other ones that always impress me are the folks who are deeply ensconced in the system, who are, chosen by the regime at an early age for some talent or are well connected, and through some sort of breaking point, basically have a realization and say, oh, actually, I think I'm going to vote with my feet. I'm going to leave, or I'm going to proselytize to folks around me about what I have come to see as a different truth from what is mandated to us as the truth. And that's, that's a psychologically difficult thing to do in much more open places. To see people do that where the stakes are so high is something that is just endlessly impressive to me. And I've heard many stories that follow that general arc, and am never they never get old in terms of just the incredible both bravery and individual kind of ness of thought that is a tough thing to stand out.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked a lot today. There's been so much, I'm sure, to absorb and to learn. There's so much more, obviously, we could talk about. But I do want to encourage folks, we will drop a few links into the chat, which will be both of the reports that Nat led on this topic, and both are quite long, but at the very least would encourage you to read the summary. There are very specific anecdotes from interviews that he did with many North Korean refugees, defectors, travelers in there. If you are interested in more specific types of stories and anecdotes, I also will plug our documentary, The Jangmadang Generation. If you have not watched that yet, it is available for free on YouTube on our Liberty in North Korea YouTube channel. And I think we have it in 10 different languages, but it really takes a deep dive into looking into the lives of North Korean millennials and how they are driving many of these changes, when it comes to information technology, these social economic changes and the role that they're playing. So those are some resources I would definitely encourage everyone to check out. We have just a few minutes left here, so I do want to try to get to maybe one or two more questions. So, Vanny asks, as someone who's researching North Korea by themselves, where would you start? What parts of North Korea and their technology use still need to be researched more and are lacking data? So I think this is a great question. In other words, what are some of the greatest needs in this area of what can we do on the outside to help accelerate some of these changes on the inside? And what are some of those challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one of the great challenges that I think the North Korean regime is very intentionally erecting right now in trying to make North Korean information controls a much more domestic affair. In the broadcast era and in the kind of like USB era, we'll say, there was a lot that outside actors could do quite directly in terms of like pushing in content, either through broadcast or physically. They're attempting to basically make that much harder. On the other hand, there are lots of ways that our understanding of these technologies, that we're already seeing, like a really interesting small field of software developers, engineers, and others who are diving into the bits of North Korean hardware and software that have leaked out of the country. That essentially that analysis can make its way back into North Korea and help feed that nascent culture of hackers and modders in North Korea who, aren't able to just go on Stack Overflow and figure out how to do that on their own, who can't get into, online forums and learn to do this as in a kind of autodidact way that we classically think of as the kind of, hacker playbook. And so in us helping to do a little bit of that general understanding and decoding externally, hopefully we can help then push some of that information back into the country, which will then allow folks on the ground to accelerate their own learning and find a little bit more space in that incredibly tight enforcement environment.
Definitely. I'm going to just end here with one last question from Kaylin. And the question is, how could a common person such as myself pursue a career fighting for human rights? It is my dream to work alongside all of you. Any specific degree? This is a great opportunity. Now, what can people do to get more involved in specifically this work or in this issue?
I mean, I think on the one hand, this issue is so complex that it needs basically every skill set. So
True.
I have long been an advocate of like, you don't need to be an expert on everything. Take the thing that you are good at, that you are specialized in, and figure out how you best apply it. I mean, there are North Korean NGOs that, NGOs focused on North Korea who need accountants. If that is your specialty, there is someone who will, need that skill set. And then honestly, supporting organizations like Link, who are just this committed to figuring out, all right, this tactic didn't work. The North Korean regime updated their own strategy. Like, how do we respond? This is a long game and a long fight. So the dedication, as much as any particular skill, is what I think is really going to make a big difference at the end of the day. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet, but being in it for the long haul is certainly very important.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And I agree with you 100%. We need people who are experts in what they do and can bring both passion, but also those skill sets and expertise. So I will also use this as an opportunity to plug some very specific things that everyone can do if you are interested in taking action right now, today. So if you're wondering how you can make a difference, here's 3 simple things. First, you can go and visit withthenorthkoreanpeople.org. You can sign the Allies Pledge, essentially joining this movement, and just to acknowledge that you are standing in solidarity with the North Korean people and with all of us around the world. We'll drop that link into the chat, and so be sure to check it out. And you can also see on that site where thousands of people around the world are also supporting from. The second thing is that you can check out the incredible stories of North Korean people, as I'd mentioned, both in Nat's reports. You can check it out in our documentaries on our YouTube page and also on our social handles. We have some pretty incredible stories and a lot of North Korean friends who have bravely and so generously been willing to share their stories and perspectives with us and with all of you. And so we will drop some of those handles into the chat for you as well. And don't be shy and share that with your friends and family too. Lastly, we are doing a pretty incredible and exciting event coming up here in June. So on June 3rd in Long Beach, California, we are going to be hosting a one-day summit where you will have the opportunity to hear from inspiring North Korean leaders and activists, and you'll also have a chance to meet other allies and supporters from around the world who will be joining us on that one day. It will be amazing, inspiring, incredible. Really encourage you guys to be there. Nat and I will also be there, and we'd love to see you too. So you can go ahead and reserve your spot now at the link that you'll see in the chat. And as a thank you for joining us today, if you use the code JOINUS20, you will get 20% off. Don't worry, it's not really that expensive at all. And in the FAQ section, if it is challenging for you to buy a ticket, please don't let that be the reason not to join us. We have scholarships and ways to get you here. So be sure to check it out and to ping us if you have any questions. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today for this incredible conversation. There's so much more we can talk about. If we didn't get to your questions, I'm so sorry. I hope that you'll follow along. You'll read all of the things that we have dropped in the chat for you guys to check out. But I really want to thank you all so much for joining us, and especially a huge thanks to Nat for taking the time to share his incredible insights, expertise, and perspectives with us today. You know, we know that change is unpredictable, but it is inevitable. And although, like Nat said, we don't know the pathway North Korea will take, we don't know how change is going to happen in a more significant way and what that's going to look like. But what we do know is that it has already started. And the North Korean people themselves are the ones that are creating and promoting and pushing these changes from within the country. And we have a unique opportunity on the outside to support these changes and to support North Korean people and to find ways to help accelerate and bring forward more significant change. So thank you all so much for joining us today and for standing with the North Korean people in their pursuit of freedom. And thank you, Nat.